My husband threw my suitcase into the freezing Seattle snow and screamed that he knew he was sterile. He called me a cheating liar and locked the door, leaving me pregnant and homeless in the dead of winter. But a few hours later, a lawyer from Chicago called to inform me that my first husband from 2018 had placed a $188 million estate in trust for me with two conditions. My name is Lydia. I am 33 years old, and until that freezing December night, I thought I was building a life with the man of my dreams. If you have ever had your world shattered by the person you trusted most, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to hear how a frozen embryo and a voice from my past helped me destroy the people who tried to ruin me. The evening began with what was supposed to be a celebration of our 5th wedding anniversary. I had left my office at the financial auditing firm early to prepare a beautiful dinner. The table was set with our best crystal, and the roasted salmon Carter loved was cooling on the counter. When Carter walked through the door, he barely looked at me. He was 36, the founder of a tech startup that constantly drained our resources, but he carried himself with the arrogance of a billionaire. I pushed my exhaustion aside and handed him a small velvet box after we sat down. Inside was the positive pregnancy test I had taken that morning. I expected shock. I expected a moment of disbelief followed by a tight embrace. Instead, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He picked up his wine glass and hurled it against the dining room wall. The expensive red wine splashed across the white paint like a crime scene. He leaned across the table, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you think I am stupid, Lydia? Do you think I do not know how to count? I have known I am sterile for over a year. I got tested in secret. You are harboring a bastard child under my roof, and you thought you could trick me into paying for it?" Before I could even formulate a response, he grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the front door. Sitting in the hallway was my suitcase. He had packed it before he even got home. This was premeditated. He shoved me out onto the porch into the biting winter wind and threw my suitcase right into a snowbank. He screamed that I was a worthless cheat and slammed the heavy oak door. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sickening finality. I stood there shivering in my thin indoor sweater. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers to call a hotel. I opened my banking app to transfer money from our joint account. As a senior financial auditor, I deal with numbers every single day of my life. I know my accounts down to the cent. But as the screen loaded, I watched in absolute horror. The balance of $85,000, money that came almost entirely from my annual salary, had been reduced to zero. Carter had drained the entire account. He had frozen my credit cards. He had locked me out of my own life. I grabbed my suitcase and dragged it to the driveway where my car was parked. It was a luxury SUV whose lease I paid every month, but Carter had insisted on registering it under his startup for what he called tax efficiency. I turned the heater to full power and drove toward Beatrice's affluent neighborhood because I needed a warm room, a telephone charger, and 5 minutes to understand what had happened. When I knocked on her massive double doors, Beatrice opened them, wearing the silk robe I had bought her for Christmas. She did not look surprised. "Carter already called me," she said with a smug smile. "Hand over the keys, Lydia. The vehicle belongs to my son's company. You do not get to drive away in his property after betraying him." I started to answer, but my attention moved past her into the brightly lit living room. Penelope Carter's 24-year-old secretary was sitting on the velvet sofa in his college hoodie, with a mug of tea balanced above a clearly rounded stomach. She looked at least 4 months pregnant. The sight did not prove Carter had lied about being sterile. It proved something worse. If his diagnosis was real, then Penelope's child could not be his either. Yet Beatrice had welcomed her as the mother of Carter's future family, while they used my pregnancy as evidence of betrayal. If the diagnosis was false, then Carter had invented it solely to condemn me. Either possibilities exposed the same coordinated plan. Penelope rested one hand on her belly and smiled as if she had already taken possession of my home. Beatrice's expression confirmed that this was not a spontaneous reaction to the pregnancy test. The drained accounts, the packed suitcase, the company title on the vehicle, and Penelope waiting comfortably inside had all been arranged before dinner. Carter wanted to replace me, without negotiating over the house, the savings, or the debts he had accumulated. His infertility claim was not an explanation. It was a weapon. Beatrice pulled the keys from my frozen fingers. Penelope raised Carter's mug in a silent toast from the sofa. Then the double doors closed in my face, leaving me without transportation, shelter, or access to the money I had earned. I walked 2 miles through the dark, icy suburban streets until I found a bus shelter. The wind cut through my clothing as I sat on the frozen metal bench and opened the secure portal for the Seattle Fertility Center. Carter had called me a cheating liar, but the child growing inside me had not come from an affair. Before Carter, there was Harrison, my first husband. We making in 2018 and underwent fertility treatment together. Several viable embryos were created from my eggs and Harrison's sperm. When pressure from his wealthy family forced our divorce, we signed a detailed embryo disposition agreement. Harrison granted me exclusive authority to decide whether the remaining embryos would be stored, donated, or transferred. The agreement also recognized him as the genetic parent of any child born from them, while leaving physical and legal responsibility with me unless we later signed a different parenting plan. 3 months ago, after 2 years of Carter refusing every serious conversation about children, I decided to use one embryo. The clinic's legal department reviewed the divorce decree, the disposition agreement, and the embryo's chain of custody. Because Harrison was still alive, the clinic also requested a written reaffirmation through his attorney. He signed it without contacting me directly. I believed he was simply honoring the promise we made when our marriage ended. I did not know he was terminally ill or quietly restructuring his estate around the possibility of our child. I paid for the procedure from a private account Carter could not access. I planned to tell him the truth during our anniversary dinner and offer him a lawful choice. He could accept that the child was not biologically his and discuss a step-parent role, or we could end the marriage without cruelty. Instead, he prepared my eviction in advance and used his infertility as a weapon. I studied the clinic's consent certificates, the physician's transfer report, and Harrison's notarized reaffirmation. Every step was documented. The pregnancy was legal, medically verified, and entirely separate from Carter. He thought he had thrown a worthless, unfaithful wife into the snow. In reality, he had discarded a woman carrying Harrison's biological child, protected by records he could never talk his way around. I spent the longest night of my life sitting in a 24-hour diner near the bus station. I ordered a single cup of hot water with lemon because I only had $3 in cash in my coat pocket. As an auditor, my mind naturally categorizes disasters. I had $0 in checking. I had zero access to credit. I had no vehicle and no home. I was just a woman with a suitcase of office clothes and a tiny growing life inside her. I felt utterly defeated watching the sun slowly rise over Seattle, casting a gray, depressing light over the snow-covered streets. Exactly at 6 in the morning, my phone vibrated against the diner table. It was an unknown number with a Chicago area code. I answered it, my voice rough and hoarse. A deep, commanding, professional voice spoke on the other end. "Miss Lydia, my name is Bennett. I am the senior trust attorney for the Harrison estate. I am calling to inform you that Harrison passed away yesterday after an illness he had kept private for 8 months. I am profoundly sorry for your loss." I stopped breathing. The diner around me seemed to fade into total silence. Harrison was dead. The man who had loved me enough to let me go was gone forever. A tear slipped down my cold cheek. Before I could even begin to process the heavy grief, Bennett continued speaking with absolute legal precision. Harrison structured his assets very carefully before his passing. He knew you would never ask for help, so he forced the issue. He placed his entire estate in a private trust worth exactly $188 million. You are its conditional lifetime beneficiary, and any child from your preserved embryos is the protected remainder heir. The words hit me like a physical shockwave. $188 million. I stared at my cup of hot water, but Bennett took a deep breath, and his tone shifted into something much more serious. However, there is a catch. Harrison knew your pride, Lydia. He knew you would refuse charity. In order to claim this fortune and secure your future, you must fulfill one absolute condition, and you have exactly 1 year to do it. I sat in that diner booth clutching my phone while the waitress wiped down the counter next to me. I had exactly $3 to my name, and a flight to Chicago cost a hell of a lot more than that. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring Carter had given me 6 years ago sparkled under the harsh fluorescent lights. I used to look at it and see a promise of a beautiful future. Now, I just saw a piece of metal bought by a liar. As soon as the sun came up, I walked 5 blocks to a pawn shop that had just opened its metal grates. The pawnbroker offered me $800 for the ring. I did not negotiate. I took the cash, bought the cheapest one-way ticket to Chicago on my phone, and headed straight to the airport. I was wearing the same clothes I had been thrown out in, and I had not slept a single minute, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me moving. By noon, I was stepping out of a cab in downtown Chicago. The towering glass building of Bennett's law firm loomed over the icy streets. I walked into the lobby looking like an absolute wreck among the tailored suits and designer briefcases. But when I gave my name to the receptionist, she immediately stood up and escorted me to the private elevator. Bennett was waiting for me in a corner office that overlooked the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. He was an older man with sharp features and a tailored charcoal suit. He did not look at my wrinkled clothes or the dark circles under my eyes. He looked at me with profound respect. "Please sit down, Lydia," he said, gesturing to a leather chair. "I have ordered some hot food and tea for you. You look like you have been through a war." "I survived the night," I replied, my voice completely flat. "Tell me about Harrison. Tell me about the conditions." Bennett handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Harrison was fighting a terminal illness for the last 8 months. He kept it entirely private. He spent every waking moment structuring his assets to ensure they would fall perfectly into your hands. He knew about Carter. He hired private investigators to monitor your living situation. He knew Carter was draining your finances to fund that pathetic tech startup. Harrison wanted to intervene, but he knew your pride would never allow you to accept a bailout while you were still trying to save your marriage. So he set a trap of his own. A legal fortress designed to force you into reclaiming your power. I opened the portfolio. On top was a handwritten letter. The familiar, sharp handwriting made my chest ache. I traced the ink with my fingertips. "My dearest Lydia," the letter read. "If you are reading this, my time has run out. I never stopped watching over you. I stepped back because my family threatened to destroy your career, but I never stopped loving you. I know you are drowning. I know the man you married is a parasite feeding off your brilliance. I am leaving you my entire empire, $188 million. But I know you. If I just hand you a check, you will use it to pay off Carter's debts. You will try to save him because you are loyal. I will not allow my life's work to fund the man who is destroying you. Therefore, I have attached 2 non-negotiable conditions to this trust. Fulfill them, and the empire is yours. Fail, and the money goes to a marine conservation charity." I looked up at Bennett. What exactly does he want me to do? Condition number 1, Bennett said, leaning forward. Harrison required you to obtain a final decree dissolving your marriage and a written settlement in which Carter releases every claim to the Harrison Trust, your separate property, and any future distribution connected to the preserved embryos. He must receive no maintenance funded by the trust and no ownership interest in Apex Capital. The trust cannot be distributed until those conditions are satisfied. My auditor brain moved immediately to Washington law. The court does not divide everything automatically in half, and marital misconduct does not decide property allocation. But Carter could still demand discovery, maintenance, retirement funds, and a share of assets he claimed were connected to the marriage. He could also delay the decree long enough to prevent me from satisfying Harrison's deadline. Exactly, Bennett said. The trust is being administered by an independent trustee. At this moment, your interest is contingent, and no money has been distributed or commingled with marital funds. We will not conceal it. The separation agreement must disclose the existence of a conditional testamentary trust under a protective schedule, while requiring both parties to waive claims to inheritances, gifts trusts, and post-separation earnings. Carter must sign that waiver knowingly. I thought about Carter moving Penelope into my home, draining the accounts and throwing me into the snow because he believed I had nothing. His arrogance was an advantage. If I surrendered the visible assets he wanted, he might sign away claims to property he assumed did not exist. I did not need to hide Harrison's estate. I needed Carter to look directly at a disclosure and dismiss it as worthless. I can do that, I said, my voice cold and steady. What is the second condition? Bennett pulled out a secondary file and slid it across the desk. Condition number 2. Within 12 months of today, you must officially take over as the active Chief Executive Officer of Apex Capital. I stared at the logo on the folder. Apex Capital was not just a company. It was a massive venture capital and investment firm operating in the shadows of the financial world. They bought out failing tech startups, stripped them down, and sold them for massive profits. I had audited firms like them before. They were apex predators. Harrison owned Apex Capital, I asked my eyes, widening in realization. He was the silent majority shareholder, Bennett confirmed. He built it from the ground up. He knew your potential, Lydia. You are a senior financial auditor. You have the most ruthless, analytical mind he ever encountered. For years, you have been hiding your brilliance to massage Carter's fragile ego. You have been doing the financial heavy lifting for his failing startup, while he takes all the credit. Harrison wanted you to stop playing small. He wants you to run his empire. You must sit in the CEO chair and generate a profit within 1 year. I rested my hands on my stomach. The tiny life growing inside me, Harrison's child, needed a future. I had walked into this office as a homeless, discarded wife. I was going to walk out as a predator. The grief over losing Harrison was heavy, but it was entirely eclipsed by the fierce maternal instinct to protect our child and honor his final wish. He had given me the ultimate weapon. I just had to be ruthless enough to use it. I accept the conditions, I said, looking Bennett dead in the eye. I need a burner phone, a laptop, and a flight back to Seattle tonight. Carter thinks I am a desperate woman begging for scraps. Let him keep thinking that. Bennett smiled for the first time. It was a dangerous, knowing smile. I have already arranged a corporate apartment in downtown Seattle under a proxy name, he said, handing me a black, sleek credit card. This is an expense account tied to the law firm. It is strictly for legal and living expenses while you execute the divorce. Use it wisely. The hunt begins today, Miss Lydia. I took the card. The cold plastic felt like a loaded gun in my hand. Carter and Beatrice thought they had buried me in the snow. They did not realize I was a seed, and Harrison had just given me an entire financial empire to grow into. I packed the legal files into my bag. It was time to go back to Seattle. It was time to start the divorce and spring a trap they would never see coming. The flight back to Seattle felt like a victory lap before the race even began. I sat in the first-class cabin sipping sparkling water and looking out the window as the dark winter sky gave way to the glittering lights of the city. I was no longer the freezing, terrified woman crying at a bus stop. I was a senior financial auditor with a corporate expense account and a mandate to destroy the man who tried to ruin me. The corporate apartment Bennett had arranged was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Located on the 40th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise, it featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Puget Sound. I dropped my single, battered suitcase by the door and walked straight to the massive glass dining table. I pulled out the encrypted laptop Bennett had provided and powered it up. It was time to go to work. It was time to do exactly what I was trained to do. I was going to audit my own life. I logged into my personal financial dashboard using a secure proxy server so Carter would not be alerted to my location. I already knew he had drained our primary joint checking account of $85,000. But as my eyes scanned the deeper financial portfolios, a cold knot formed in my stomach. I clicked on my individual retirement account. The balance, which should have sat comfortably at just over $50,000, was completely gone. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the transaction history. When we first got married, Carter had manipulated me into listing him as a contingent manager on that specific retirement account, claiming it was a necessary safety net in case of medical emergencies. I had trusted my husband. That was my first mistake. Last night, while I was wandering the freezing streets, he had used a backdoor digital authorization to liquidate the entire fund. He took a massive early withdrawal penalty just to get the cash immediately. Money never truly disappears. As an auditor, I know that every dollar leaves a digital footprint. I traced the wire transfer routing numbers. The funds had not gone into his failing tech startup. They had not gone into a savings account. The entire $50,000 was wired directly to an exclusive, high-end luxury jeweler in the downtown Diamond District. I opened a new browser tab and searched for Penelope on social media. Her profile was completely public, an arrogant display of a woman who thought she had secured a billionaire lifestyle. The very first photo on her feed was posted just 3 hours ago. It showed her perfectly manicured hand resting on Carter's chest. On her ring finger sat a massive, blindingly expensive, custom diamond engagement ring. The caption read that, "He gave me the world and our perfect baby." He did not give you the world, Penelope. He gave you my retirement fund. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the post, a notification popped up on my screen. It was an email from Carter, sent to my personal address. I clicked it open. There was no greeting. There was no remorse. It was just a brutal, arrogant challenge from a man who believed he held all the power. "I know you are staying at some cheap motel, Lydia," the email read. "I know you have zero cash. I filed the initial separation papers this morning. I am claiming the house, the car, and all the remaining equity. I am claiming you abandoned the marriage. Divorce me. You leave empty-handed, I take it all. Do not even try to fight me in court because you cannot afford a lawyer. Sign the papers when my guy sends them, or I will drag this out until you are sleeping on the sidewalk." I sat back in my plush leather chair and stared at the glowing screen. A day ago, those words would have shattered me. I would have collapsed in tears, begging him to be reasonable. Today, I just smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. Carter was a tech founder who thought he was the smartest man in the room, but he was a financial idiot. By draining my retirement account and using it to purchase a non-marital asset for his mistress, he had committed a massive family law violation known as the dissipation of marital assets. Any decent judge in Washington state would penalize him heavily for that. They would force him to repay the money or award me the entire house to compensate for his theft. But I did not want the house. I did not want the $50,000 back. I did not want to drag him through a multi-year court battle over suburban scraps. I needed something much bigger. I needed him to sign a final divorce decree as fast as humanly possible so I could unlock Harrison's $188 million empire. To get that signature quickly, I needed Carter to stay exactly as arrogant and overconfident as he was right now. I needed him to believe he was completely robbing me blind. I opened a fresh document on my laptop and began typing up a response to his lawyer's separation agreement. In a standard divorce, the fight is over who gets what. I was going to flip the script entirely. I would surrender my claim to the house. I would surrender the luxury SUV. I would formally waive my right to any spousal support. I would give him every single thing he demanded on a silver platter. I would construct a divorce agreement that looked like the desperate surrender of a broken woman. But nestled deep within the complex financial jargon of the asset division clauses I was going to hide, a tiny, seemingly insignificant stipulation. A legal poison pill wrapped in compliance. He thought he was taking it all. He had no idea I was quietly tying the noose he would use to hang himself. I closed my laptop and looked out over the glittering Seattle skyline. I was not leaving empty-handed. I was clearing the board. The next morning, a courier delivered Carter's dissolution petition and proposed separation contract. I spread the documents across the glass dining table and read them as an auditor, not as a wounded wife. The petition itself used Washington's required no-fault language, alleging only that the marriage was irretrievably broken. The trap was buried in the attached settlement. Carter's lawyers had written a factual recital claiming my undisclosed pregnancy caused the separation, and that I had abandoned the marital home voluntarily. The contract released Carter from every claim connected to the drained checking account and retirement withdrawal. It awarded him the house, the company-registered vehicle, and all remaining household property. It also required me to waive maintenance and promised severe contractual penalties if I later challenged his public statements about the pregnancy. He could not obtain an at-fault divorce in Washington, but he was trying to manufacture a signed confession he could use in the press and in any later financial dispute. A normal response would have been to reject every page, subpoena the jewelry records, and ask the court for an equitable award based on his dissipation of marital funds. That fight would take months. Harrison's trust required a final decree within a year, and Carter's ego had already convinced him I was penniless. I needed a settlement he would sign quickly, but I was not going to admit adultery or conceal the trust. I drafted a counter-proposal. I replaced the false confession with neutral language, stating that the marriage was irretrievably broken after the parties separated. I still surrendered my claim to the house and vehicle, waived maintenance, and allowed Carter to keep every ownership interest in his startup. In return, the agreement contained a mutual release covering all separate property inheritances, testamentary trusts, gifts, and post-separation earnings, whether presently vested or contingent. A sealed disclosure schedule identified my potential interest in a testamentary trust whose conditions had not yet been satisfied and whose assets remained under an independent trustee. Carter would have to initial the schedule and waive any claim to it. Then I rewrote the debt provisions. Carter received the startup, but he also accepted sole responsibility between us for every business obligation he had personally guaranteed. He agreed to indemnify me against the seed notes, bridge loans, vendor liabilities, tax assessments, and any deficiency arising from the company. The clause did not magically turn corporate debt into personal debt. Carter had already signed personal guarantees on the major Obsidian credit facilities, and my language ensured he could never shift those guarantees or any marital exposure back onto me. The proposal looked generous because the visible assets went to him. The dangerous language was not hidden in microscopic print. It appeared in the same financial schedules as the house and vehicle, ready for review by his lawyer. I was relying on something more reliable than concealment. Carter's certainty that his startup was a future unicorn would make him treat the debt allocation as a gift, while his contempt for me would make the disclosed contingent trust look like an empty technicality. I printed the revised documents and arranged to meet Carter at a neutral location to sign the paperwork. I chose a sterile, brightly lit coffee shop in a busy commercial district. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a simple beige trench coat and no makeup. I pulled my hair back into a messy knot. I needed to look exactly like the defeated, desperate woman he expected to see. Carter walked into the coffee shop looking like he had just won the lottery. He was wearing a tailored navy suit and a smug smirk that made my stomach turn. He sat down across from me without even offering a greeting. He just stared at me with pure condescension. "I got your revised copy from my lawyer," Carter said, crossing his arms and leaning back in the chair. "I have to admit, Lydia, I thought you would put up more of a fight. I thought you would try to drag this out and beg for my money, but I guess sitting on a bus bench in the freezing cold gave you a quick reality check." I kept my hands folded in my lap and stared down at the table, playing my part perfectly. "I just want this to be over, Carter," I said, keeping my voice soft and defeated. "I do not have the money to fight you in court. You win. You get the house and the car. Just sign the papers so we can go our separate ways." Carter chuckled, pulling a silver pen from his jacket pocket. "You are finally acting smart. You realize that if we went to court, I would expose your disgusting behavior to the entire city. Admitting to the adultery in this document is the best thing you could have done. It saves me the trouble of destroying your professional reputation." He flipped to the back page of the document, completely ignoring the dense financial text in the middle sections. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desire to humiliate me that he did not even bother to consult his lawyer about the new debt severance clause I had inserted. He just saw that I was surrendering the house and the car, and his massive ego did the rest. "I noticed you added a little paragraph about my business debts," Carter sneered, pointing his pen at the page. "You are really terrified of owing money, aren't you? You are giving up $1 million house just to avoid being attached to my company? You always lacked vision, Lydia. You never understood how to build real wealth. My startup is going to secure a massive round of funding next quarter. You are walking away from millions just to save yourself from a little bit of risk. You are so incredibly stupid." I looked up at him, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "I am just risk-averse, Carter. You know that. I do not want anything to do with your company's finances. Please, just sign it." Carter shook his head in mock pity. "Enjoy your miserable little life of counting pennies, Lydia." He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name with a violent, arrogant flourish. He pushed the document across the table to me. I picked up my own pen and signed my name right next to his. The trap was officially set. The legal mechanism was locked into place. Carter stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. "My lawyer will file the petition and settlement this afternoon," he said. "Washington requires 90 days after filing and service before the court can enter the final decree. Do not contact me. Penelope is moving into the house tomorrow, and she does not need the stress of dealing with my unstable ex-wife." "I will not contact you," I replied, slipping the signed documents into my bag. "Have a good life, Carter." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. He walked to the luxury SUV, the one I used to pay the lease on, and drove away thinking he was the smartest man in Seattle. He thought he had outmaneuvered me. He thought he had secured $1 million home and absolute freedom. I sat alone in the coffee shop for a few more minutes, feeling the heavy weight of the past 6 years finally begin to lift off my shoulders. I took a deep breath of the warm, coffee-scented air. The false adultery claims stung my pride, but it was a remarkably cheap price to pay for absolute legal immunity. By signing that paper, Carter had unknowingly placed his head on the chopping block. He had assumed all the toxic debt of a failing company and completely severed my liability. I pulled out the burner phone Bennett had given me and dialed the Chicago number. Bennett answered on the first ring. "The papers are signed," I told Bennett, dropping the defeated act. "Once Carter is served, the 90-day clock begins." He initialed the trust. Disclosure accepted, the startup, confirmed his guarantees and waived every claim to inherited property. "Excellent work," Bennett replied. "Now we move to the next phase. An Apex Capital town car is waiting outside the coffee shop. The board has been notified that Harrison's designated successor will assume interim executive authority today. Your access credentials are active." I did not return to the apartment to pack. The signed settlement was already secured in my bag, and everything else I needed waited inside the company Harrison had built. The town car carried me through downtown Seattle, while I changed from a discarded wife into the financial auditor who would take command of an investment empire. The morning fog lifted as the vehicle entered the secured underground garage beneath Apex Capital. The building rose 50 stories above the financial district, a monolith of dark, reflective glass and black steel. I had passed it countless times on my way to a mid-level auditing job without knowing Harrison controlled it. There was no rooftop landing and no public spectacle. A security director met me beside the private elevator, verified the encrypted credential Bennett had issued, and escorted me directly to the executive floor. The elevator opened into a vast suite of polished mahogany, modern art, and panoramic windows overlooking Puget Sound. Bennett was waiting with a small group of senior executives. They studied my inexpensive beige trench coat and exhausted face with open skepticism. I walked past them, placed the coat on a chair, and sat behind Harrison's oak desk. "My name is Lydia," I said. "Under the trust succession plan and today's board resolution, I am the acting chief executive officer of Apex Capital. I have spent a decade finding liabilities executives hope no one would notice. Anyone who tests my authority will receive a department audit before the end of the day. Now bring me the venture portfolio." I did not wait for introductions or polite greetings. I walked straight to the massive oak desk at the end of the room and dropped my coat on a nearby chair. I took a seat in the high-backed leather chair that used to belong to Harrison. The leather was cool and firm. It felt incredibly right. I folded my hands on the desk and looked at the executive standing before me. "My name is Lydia," I said, my voice projecting a cold, unyielding authority that echoed off the glass walls. "As of this morning, I am the active chief executive officer of Apex Capital. I know some of you are calculating how long it will take to push me out of this chair. I highly recommend you stop right now. I spent the last decade auditing firms twice your size and finding every single hidden liability they tried to bury. If you want to test me, I will audit your individual departments by nightfall and terminate anyone hiding toxic assets or inflating their quarterly projections. Now bring me the venture capital portfolio." The room was dead silent. The skepticism vanished, completely replaced by a sharp, nervous energy. A young executive named Simon quickly stepped forward and placed a heavy, encrypted tablet on my desk. He tapped in a security code and stepped back respectfully. "These are the current active investments," Madam CEO Simon said, his voice completely professional. "The high-risk tech startup acquisitions are categorized in the red folder on the home screen." I dismissed the executives with a sharp wave of my hand, telling Bennett to stay behind. Once the heavy double doors clicked shut, leaving just the two of us in the massive suite, I pulled the tablet closer. I needed to understand exactly what kind of empire I was running. I opened the red folder and began scrolling through the raw financial data. Apex Capital was notorious for a specific type of corporate takeover strategy. They found startups that were burning through cash aggressively, bought up their debt through anonymous shell companies, and then executed hostile takeovers when the founders inevitably defaulted. It was a brutal, highly effective business model. As my eyes scanned the endless rows of financial ledgers, a specific corporate registry number caught my attention. I stopped scrolling. My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I leaned closer to the screen, bringing up the detailed breakdown of a shell company named Obsidian Holdings. Apex Capital owned Obsidian Holdings entirely, and Obsidian Holdings was the primary lender for a tech startup that sounded incredibly familiar. I quickly cross-referenced the tax identification numbers and the executive board listings. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my lips. I looked at Bennett, who was watching me with a highly amused expression. He already knew. Harrison had orchestrated this flawlessly from the very beginning. I pulled up the full capitalization table and the intricate debt structure. Carter had spent the last 2 years bragging to anyone who would listen about securing massive rounds of venture capital funding. He constantly mocked my conservative auditing job, claiming I did not understand how high-level tech financing worked. He thought he was a Silicon Valley genius for convincing an anonymous firm to front him millions of dollars in bridge loans without demanding immediate equity. He thought he was playing the market and outsmarting the industry. But looking at the master ledger, the absolute truth was staring me right in the face. Apex Capital was the anonymous firm. Apex Capital owned the shell company that owned his debt. Harrison had been quietly buying up every single loan, every single credit line, and every single financial lifeline Carter's startup relied on to keep the lights on. My ex-husband did not own a successful tech company. He owned a hollow shell, resting entirely on a massive mountain of toxic debt. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen, letting the sheer magnitude of the situation wash over me. Carter had literally thrown me out into the snow because he thought I was a financial burden. He had moved Penelope into my home, believing that her pregnancy secured his future while denouncing mine. He and his mother Beatrice had laughed at my supposed misfortune, confident that they held all the cards. They had no idea that while they were busy changing the locks on a suburban house, I was being handed the keys to the financial guillotine hovering directly over their necks. Bennett poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and set one near my hand. Harrison spent the last 8 months of his life structuring this exact scenario, Bennett said quietly. He watched Carter leverage your credit score to secure the initial seed money. He watched Carter mistreat you. Harrison knew that if he simply warned you, your sense of loyalty would have forced you to try and save the marriage. He needed you to see Carter's true nature, and he needed to give you the perfect instrument of retribution once you did. I ran my hand over the smooth mahogany wood of the desk. Harrison had given me a masterpiece. Carter was currently sitting in his office playing the role of a wealthy tech founder preparing to impress his investors. He was oblivious to the fact that his primary investor was the very woman he had discarded just 24 hours ago. He was legally bound by the divorce papers he had signed earlier that morning, absorbing all the corporate debt while shielding me from the fallout. He had built his own trap, baited it himself, and eagerly locked the door behind him. I tapped the screen, bringing up the loan covenants and the default clauses attached to Carter's funding. The terms were incredibly aggressive. Apex Capital had the legal right to demand a comprehensive financial audit at any time. If any discrepancies were found, we could trigger an immediate call on the debt, demanding full repayment within days. Carter had been cooking his books for months, using company funds to buy designer clothes for Penelope and luxury vehicles for Beatrice. A blind man could find the fraud in his ledgers. Prepare a formal audit notice. I told Bennett, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I want a team of our most ruthless forensic accountants assigned to Obsidian Holdings immediately. We are going to rip Carter's startup apart, page by page, dollar by dollar. Consider it done, Bennett said, a fierce glint of satisfaction in his eyes. I leaned back in Harrison's chair, resting my hand on my stomach where our child was safely growing. As the new CEO of Apex Capital, I now owned 80% of Carter's debt. His entire miserable, arrogant existence, his company, his lifestyle, his stolen money was entirely resting in the palm of my hand. Carter thought he had taken everything from me. He had no idea I now owned the very air he breathed. The forensic audit began the very next morning. Simon and his team of ruthless financial analysts worked through the night, tearing into the digital ledgers of Carter's startup. Within 48 hours, Simon placed a thick black binder on my expansive mahogany desk. The financial reality of the company was far worse than I had ever anticipated. Carter had completely abandoned any pretense of running a legitimate tech enterprise. The venture capital funds we had provided through our proxy firm Obsidian Holdings were legally designated for software development, engineering salaries, and server expansion. Instead, the expense reports read like the personal diary of a reckless lottery winner. I flipped through the highlighted transactions, my auditor instincts sharp and completely detached from any lingering emotion. Carter had authorized massive corporate withdrawals to fund his new lifestyle with Penelope. There were receipts for a $50,000 down payment on a custom imported sports car registered exclusively in her name. There were weekly charges of $5,000 at luxury boutiques and high-end spas across downtown Seattle. He was expensing lavish multi-course dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, claiming them as client entertainment when the guest list only ever included his mistress. He had even used company funds to pay for the rapid remodeling of the suburban house he had just kicked me out of, outfitting it with imported Italian marble and custom nursery furniture. He was treating the corporate operating account like a personal, limitless piggy bank, completely oblivious to the fact that his primary investor was tracking every single fraudulent swipe of his card. The cash burn rate was mathematically catastrophic. According to Simon's detailed projections, Carter's company would fail to make payroll by the end of the current week. He had no safety net and no secondary revenue streams. His entire operation was utterly dependent on the next scheduled tranche of funding from Obsidian Holdings. I smiled coldly, staring at the undeniable proof of his embezzlement. I issued a single immediate directive to my team. Freeze the payout. Suspend all incoming capital transfers immediately and issue a formal notice citing severe irregularities in their quarterly expense reports. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Through our corporate surveillance, we monitored the frantic activity radiating from his office. Carter bombarded the Obsidian Holdings proxy email addresses with urgent demands. He attempted to call the anonymous managing directors dozens of times a day, begging them to release the funds. He sent manic emails claiming the irregular expenses were standard corporate networking costs essential for securing new talent. When he received absolutely zero response from our end, genuine panic truly set in. Carter was trapped. He had less than 4 days to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars to cover his operating costs, employee salaries, and office leases. If word leaked to the industry that he could not make payroll, his remaining minor angel investors would flee in terror, and his impending public software launch would collapse entirely. He could not approach traditional banking institutions for a commercial loan because his personal credit was already maxed out and his business assets were entirely leveraged to my firm. He was bleeding out rapidly, and he had nowhere left to turn. Desperate men always return to their most loyal enablers. Carter turned to his mother. Beatrice lived in a sprawling suburban estate, a massive, pristine house that my former father-in-law had worked his entire life to pay off before he passed away. It was her sanctuary and her ultimate social status symbol. I hired a discreet private investigator to track Carter's movements during this critical 48-hour window. The reports and photographs confirmed exactly what I suspected he would do. Carter drove his newly leased sports car straight to Beatrice's estate, right in the middle of a workday. He spun a pathetic, desperate web of lies. According to the financial movements that followed, he told his mother that his company was on the absolute brink of a multi-billion-dollar valuation, but a minor clerical banking error was temporarily freezing his liquid assets. He convinced her that if she just provided a short-term bridge loan to get him through the week, he would pay her back tenfold within the month. He promised her a private yacht, a vacation home in the south of France, and unprecedented social prestige among her wealthy friends. Penelope played her part in the deception flawlessly. She showed up at Beatrice's house an hour later, rubbing her pregnant belly and crying theatrical tears about how the stress of the banking error was bad for the baby's health. She expertly manipulated the older woman's desire for a prestigious grandchild and a successful son. Beatrice, blinded by her own arrogance and her absolute delusional belief in her golden boy, did not hesitate for a single second. She wanted desperately to prove that kicking me out and replacing me with Penelope was the right choice. She wanted to prove that her son was a genius who did not need my modest accounting salary to survive. Traditional banks could not meet Carter's payroll deadline, so Beatrice went to a predatory private lender. She signed a short-term bridge note secured by a first-position deed of trust against her fully paid suburban mansion. The note carried a punishing interest rate, a 90-day maturity date, and a personal guarantee. In exchange, the lender issued a cashier's check for $500,000, which Beatrice handed directly to Carter. It was the only substantial asset she possessed. To a startup burning cash at Carter's rate, however, the loan purchased only a few weeks of survival and placed her home, one missed maturity payment, away from foreclosure. I sat in the quiet power of the CEO office at Apex Capital, watching the digital banking alert flash across my encrypted monitor as the massive deposit hit Carter's business account. He actually thought he had survived the crisis. He thought he had outsmarted the system once again. He was so relieved that he threw a lavish catered lunch for his office staff that very afternoon, posting photos online to project an image of unstoppable corporate success. He had absolutely no idea that he had just dragged his own mother onto his rapidly sinking ship. Beatrice had thrown away her life savings and the secure roof over her head to fund Penelope's extravagant shopping habits and Carter's grandiose delusions. They were celebrating a temporary illusion of safety while I held the detonator to their entire existence. By bringing Beatrice's house into the financial crossfire, Carter had unwittingly handed me the leverage to destroy not just his fraudulent business, but the entire arrogant family structure that had tried to leave me freezing in the winter snow. The $500,000 Beatrice sacrificed her home to secure bought Carter exactly 11 days of borrowed time. He paid his furious vendors. He made payroll for his terrified engineering team. Then, like a gambling addict handed a fresh stack of chips, he immediately reverted to his toxic habits. Through our corporate surveillance networks, I watched the digital transactions roll in. Our system flagged a new $20,000 charge for a VIP nursery suite designer and another $10,000 for a catered engagement party booking. He genuinely believed the storm had passed. He believed his own lies. But 11 days later, reality came crashing back down with brutal force. The operating accounts hit zero again, and the bridge loan from his mother was completely exhausted. On a rainy Tuesday morning, a massive encrypted file landed on the secure servers of Obsidian Holdings. It was marked with highest urgency. Carter was formally requesting an emergency capital injection of $5 million. He dressed the application up in arrogant Silicon Valley buzzwords, calling it a Series B strategic expansion round to mask the stench of his desperation. But my seasoned auditor eyes translated the corporate jargon instantly. It was a frantic plea for a bailout. He was drowning and begging his anonymous lifeline to pull him from the wreckage before he lost everything. I called Simon and the senior forensic accounting team into the main glass-walled conference room. I projected Carter's financial application onto the massive digital display board spanning the length of the room. Carter had submitted altered balance sheets, inflated revenue projections, and completely fabricated user engagement metrics. He assumed the anonymous executives at Obsidian Holdings were just wealthy venture capitalists who only looked at the bottom line and flashy charts. He thought he could dazzle us with projected growth curves and fabricated market dominance. He had no idea the person evaluating his survival was a senior financial auditor who knew every single trick he was trying to pull. "Tear it to shreds," I told Simon, my voice echoing in the silent room. "Do not just look at the surface numbers. Cross-reference every single vendor invoice against the state business registry. Track the IP addresses of his supposed active users. Pull the tax identification numbers for his independent contractors. I want this company dissected, down to the molecular level. I want every single lie exposed and categorized." For the next 48 hours, the executive suite turned into an absolute war zone. We ordered black coffee and locked the doors, working with relentless precision. The results were not just grounds for a corporate bankruptcy, they were grounds for a massive federal indictment. Simon presented the final findings in a stark, comprehensive dossier bound in black leather. I sat at my mahogany desk, flipping through the pages. Carter was not just a terrible businessman with a bloated ego. He was a reckless, arrogant criminal. First, my team exposed his blatant revenue distortion. Carter had claimed a 300% increase in monthly recurring revenue over the past quarter, a metric designed to guarantee our $5 million investment. But my analysts discovered a massive circular funding scheme known in the auditing world as round tripping. He was taking portions of the initial venture capital money we had previously given him, funneling it through offshore proxy accounts, and using it to buy his own software licenses under fake corporate identities. He was artificially inflating his sales metrics to make the company look wildly profitable. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme wrapped in a sleek tech interface designed to defraud his investors. Then came the money laundering. Carter had listed over $200,000 in external consulting fees paid to a boutique marketing firm registered in Delaware. The firm was called Horizon Solutions, LLC. I ordered my legal team to pierce the corporate veil of that specific limited liability company. It took less than an hour to uncover the sole proprietor on the incorporation documents. It was Penelope. Carter was drafting fake invoices for non-existent marketing services and using them to launder corporate investor funds directly into his mistress's personal bank account. He was stealing capital meant for software development to fund her designer wardrobe, her engagement ring, and their lavish lifestyle, all while writing it off as a tax-deductible business expense. The final nail in the coffin was his physical asset fraud. Carter had reclassified the $1 million suburban home he had just kicked me out of as a corporate research and development facility. He was using venture capital funds to pay the property taxes, the luxury remodeling costs, and the utility bills, claiming it was a dedicated workspace for his remote engineering team. In reality, it was just a suburban love nest he was building with stolen money. He was committing federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and gross embezzlement on an unprecedented scale. I closed the black binder and rested my hands on my stomach. Carter had created evidence capable of destroying the company and exposing him personally. The SEC could pursue civil securities remedies if his investor solicitations fell within its jurisdiction, but it could not arrest him. Criminal charges would require a referral to federal prosecutors and an investigation by agencies with criminal authority. The audit bank records false certifications and shell company invoices were enough to begin that process. Penelope's ownership of Horizon Solutions also placed her directly inside the financial trail. I did not transmit the final package that afternoon. Immediate receivership forfeiture and criminal restraint could freeze the startup before Carter completed the separation agreement and could create new arguments about the allocation of marital liabilities. Bennett instructed us to preserve every file, maintain an authenticated chain of custody, and prepare parallel civil and criminal referral packages. I wanted Carter to finalize the debt allocation, appear before me, and make one last documented request for money using the false statements. Then the evidence would move through counsel, not through an anonymous email, and the government could act on a complete record. I pressed the intercom button on my desk, connecting directly to Simon's office. Draft a formal response from Obsidian Holdings, I instructed my tone, completely devoid of mercy. Tell Carter his emergency funding request has passed the initial review phase. Tell him the board of directors is highly intrigued by his revenue projections, but requires an in-person meeting to finalize the $5 million transfer. Simon paused on the other end of the line, a hint of hesitation in his voice. Madam CEO, if he comes to the building to meet the board, he will see you. That is exactly the point, Simon, I replied, a cold, razor-sharp smile touching my lips. Tell him to come to the Apex Capital headquarters this Friday at noon. Let him believe he is walking in here to collect a massive check. Let him put on his best tailored suit and his most arrogant smirk. Have security escort him directly to my office on the top floor. It is time for Carter to finally meet his primary investor, face to face. 2 days before the scheduled Friday meeting, Bennett requested an in-person consultation to finalize the legal paperwork for the impending corporate slaughter. He booked a private corner booth at Le Chandelier, an ultra-exclusive French restaurant in downtown Seattle, renowned for its months-long waiting list and exorbitant tasting menus. It was the exact type of establishment Carter had always desperately wanted to be seen in, but could never actually afford without drowning his credit cards. I did not show up looking like the discarded wife Carter had thrown into the snow. I used the corporate expense account to procure a wardrobe fitting the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar investment firm. I wore a tailored midnight blue blazer over a pristine white silk blouse, paired with understated but incredibly expensive pearl earrings. The reflection staring back at me in the restaurant mirrors was sharp, polished, and completely bulletproof. Bennett and I sat in the dimly lit booth, surrounded by the quiet hum of wealthy patrons and clinking crystal glasses. Spread across the table between our plates of seared scallops and truffles were the legal documents that would execute Carter's total ruin. Bennett confirmed that the divorce decree was actively processing through the county court system. Carter had not contested a single clause. He was so eager to secure his false victory that he had completely ignored the financial severance trap I had hidden in the final pages. As Bennett poured us both a glass of sparkling water, the heavy mahogany doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. My auditor instincts immediately registered the sudden shift in the room's energy. I looked up and saw Carter walking into the main dining area, with Penelope clinging tightly to his arm. He was practically vibrating with arrogant triumph. He was wearing a brand-new, bespoke velvet dinner jacket that I instantly recognized as a $5,000 purchase from a high-end boutique. Penelope was draped in a maternity dress that easily cost another $2,000. She was intentionally resting her hand on her pregnant belly, making sure the massive stolen diamond on her finger caught the light of the overhead chandeliers. They were here to celebrate. Carter genuinely believed that the email he received from Obsidian Holdings was his golden ticket. He thought Friday was going to make him a multi-millionaire. He was spending money he did not even have yet to toast a victory that did not exist. I watched them interact with the hostess. Carter was loud and abrasive, demanding a prime table near the window. As the hostess guided them through the dining room, his eyes scanned the crowd, looking for anyone important he could network with. That was when his gaze landed directly on my corner booth. He stopped dead in his tracks. I could see the gears turning in his head as he processed the scene. He saw his recently evicted, penniless wife sitting in the most expensive restaurant in Seattle. He saw me wearing designer silk and looking completely unfazed, and most importantly, he saw Bennett. He saw a distinguished older man in a charcoal suit sitting across from me, leaning over a table covered in dense legal paperwork. Carter's fragile ego could not handle the visual discrepancy. He had crafted a narrative where I was a broken, weeping mess sleeping on a bus bench. Seeing me thrive shattered that illusion, and he immediately moved to tear me back down. Leaving Penelope standing awkwardly in the aisle, he marched directly over to our booth. "Well, this is a pathetic sight," Carter said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the neighboring tables. He placed his hands on his hips and looked back and forth between me and Bennett with pure, unfiltered disgust. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply stared at him, waiting for him to dig his own grave. "I was wondering how you were going to survive," Carter sneered, his eyes raking over my silk blouse. "I guess you figured it out quickly. Hooking up with some rich old man to pay your rent, huh? Is that how you are affording the appetizers tonight, Lydia? Does he know you are carrying a bastard child, or are you scamming him too?" Bennett did not react with anger. As a seasoned trust attorney who handled the estates of billionaires, he possessed a terrifying level of professional composure. He simply set his pen down, folded his hands, and looked at Carter the way a scientist observes a particularly stupid insect. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my honor. I knew the exact dollar amount of the fraudulent loans hanging over Carter's head, and that knowledge provided me with absolute, impenetrable armor. "You should lower your voice, Carter," I said, my tone perfectly level and chillingly calm. "You are wearing a jacket paid for by embezzled corporate funds. You are celebrating a software launch that has 0 actual users. You are standing in a restaurant you can only afford because your mother mortgaged her entire life to bail you out. You really should not throw stones when your entire glass house is built on federal wire fraud." Carter's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief flash of panic crossed his eyes before his towering arrogance forced it back down. He scoffed loudly, shaking his head. "You are delusional, Lydia," he shot back, leaning closer to the table. "You are just bitter because you are walking away with absolutely nothing. You are trying to sound smart, but you have no idea how the real business world works. While you are sitting here begging for handouts from a sugar daddy, I am closing a $5 million Series B funding round this Friday. My primary investors love my projections. I am about to be richer than you could ever comprehend." I looked at Penelope, who was hovering a few feet away, looking extremely uncomfortable under the gazes of the wealthy patrons. Then I looked back at Carter. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an apex predator looking at its trapped prey. "I truly hope Friday brings you exactly what you deserve, Carter," I said smoothly. "Enjoy your dinner. It might be the last expensive meal you have for a very long time." I stood up from the booth, signaling to Bennett that our meeting was concluded. Bennett gathered the legal files and placed them securely into his leather briefcase. I stepped past Carter, not giving him another inch of my space or another second of my time. He tried to block my path, to get the last word, but I walked right through his personal space, forcing him to step aside. Carter followed us toward the exit, his bruised ego demanding one final insult. "Go ahead and run away, Lydia," he called out as we reached the heavy glass doors. "Keep playing pretend. We both know you will be bankrupt by next month." I pushed through the doors and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The valet immediately snapped to attention. I did not walk toward the nearby bus stop. I did not hail a cheap taxi. I stood perfectly still on the curb as a sleek, midnight black Maybach glided smoothly out of the VIP parking lane and pulled up directly in front of me. The license plate was registered to the executive fleet of Apex Capital. The uniformed chauffeur stepped out and opened the rear passenger door, bowing slightly. "Good evening, Madam CEO," he said, clearly and respectfully. I turned around just before stepping into the luxurious leather interior. Carter and Penelope were standing on the other side of the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling glass windows. They had watched the entire exchange. Carter's face was entirely drained of color. His jaw was slightly slack, and his eyes were wide with total incomprehension. He looked at the chauffeur. He looked at the Maybach. He looked at my designer clothes. He was trying desperately to make the math work in his head, but the numbers were impossible for his arrogant brain to process. I gave him one final, cold, calculated look through the glass. I did not wave. I did not gloat. I simply slid into the back of the Maybach and let the chauffeur close the heavy armored door. As the luxury vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the downtown traffic, I left Carter standing on the sidewalk, suffocating in his own sudden, overwhelming confusion. He was starting to realize that he had stepped into a game he did not understand. But he still had absolutely no idea that Friday at noon the trap was going to snap his world completely in half. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting rain that washed the streets of Seattle clean. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO office, looking down at the financial district below. The Maybach ride outside the restaurant had planted a seed of doubt in Carter's mind, but his towering ego would have rationalized it away by now. He probably convinced himself I had just hired an actor or blown my last few dollars on a luxury rental car just to spite him. He was fundamentally incapable of comprehending a reality where a woman he deemed inferior held actual, undeniable power over him. Today I was going to tear that delusion apart, atom by atom. Simon knocked once and entered the vast executive suite. He carried a single black folder. It was not a pitch deck. It was a complete financial autopsy of Carter's fraudulent tech startup. It contained the fake invoices, the laundered funds sent to Penelope, the illegal use of corporate money for his suburban house renovations, and the undeniable mathematical proof that his company was effectively bankrupt. I took the folder and placed it precisely in the center of the massive mahogany desk. It was the only item on the surface. A solitary black tombstone waiting for its occupant. At exactly 11:45, the security desk in the main lobby alerted me that my 12 o'clock appointment had arrived. I pulled up the high-definition security feeds on my encrypted monitor. Carter walked through the revolving glass doors of the Apex Capital building, looking like a man who owned the entire world. He was wearing the exact same bespoke velvet jacket he had worn at the restaurant. A deeply stupid financial decision for a morning corporate meeting. But he was obsessed with projecting extreme wealth. He strutted up to the reception desk, demanding to be led up to the executive floor. He did not ask politely. He spoke to the security staff with the dismissive arrogance of a man who believed he was minutes away from securing a $5 million check. I watched as Simon intercepted him in the lobby. Simon played his part beautifully, maintaining a cold professional demeanor as he issued Carter a VIP visitor badge. Carter tried to make small talk, attempting to establish dominance by aggressively shaking Simon's hand and dropping ridiculous Silicon Valley buzzwords about disruptive market synergies. Simon simply nodded and guided him toward the private executive elevator. The camera feed switched to the interior of the elevator car. Carter adjusted his tie, checked his reflection in the mirrored walls, and practiced his winning smile. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was actively ascending to his own financial execution. I pressed a button under my desk, and the heavy privacy blinds lowered slightly, dimming the expansive office into a cool, intimidating shadow. I turned the heavy, high-backed leather CEO chair completely around so that it faced the rain-slicked windows overlooking the Puget Sound. I sat down, crossed my legs, and waited with my back to the door. The soundproofing in the executive suite was absolute. When the heavy double oak doors finally clicked open, the silence in the room amplified the sharp, confident sound of Carter's expensive leather shoes stepping onto the plush carpet. Simon cleared his throat. "Madam CEO, your 12 o'clock appointment is here to present his emergency funding proposal." "Thank you, Simon," I said, keeping my voice perfectly modulated and low so the acoustics of the room disguised my familiar pitch. "You may leave us." The heavy doors clicked shut, locking us inside. Carter was standing in the center of the room. I could hear the slight rustle of his expensive suit as he shifted his weight. He was trying to assess the dynamic. He saw the massive desk, the imposing chair, turned away from him, and the sprawling view of the stormy city. The intimidating silence of the room was deliberately designed to crush the confidence of desperate men, and Carter was the most desperate man in Seattle. Carter cleared his throat, trying to project absolute authority. "Good afternoon," he began, launching immediately into his rehearsed pitch. "First of all, I want to thank the board of Obsidian Holdings and Apex Capital for bringing me in today. As you have seen from my initial financial disclosures, my company is on the precipice of a massive valuation explosion. We are disrupting the entire software landscape. The $5 million Series B expansion capital we are discussing today is not a bailout. It is a highly exclusive strategic partnership opportunity for your firm to get in on the ground floor of a unicorn enterprise before we take this public." I sat perfectly still, listening to him lie through his teeth. It was fascinating to hear the sheer audacity of his fraud up close. He actually believed he was outsmarting the apex predators of the financial world. "My user acquisition metrics are off the charts," Carter continued, pacing slightly, warming up to his own delusion. "We have secured major enterprise contracts that are currently in the final stages of legal review. The capital injection today will strictly be utilized for high-level engineering acquisitions and expanding our server infrastructure to handle the massive influx of new clients. Our external marketing partner, Horizon Solutions LLC, has guaranteed a global reach by the next quarter. I am offering Apex Capital a guaranteed 20% return on investment within the first 6 months." He brought up Horizon Solutions. He actually stood in my office and used the fake corporate entity he created for Penelope as a selling point to secure my money. He stopped talking, waiting for a response from the faceless executive sitting in the chair. He expected applause. He expected a handshake and a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. He expected to walk out of this building a king. I slowly reached out and grasped the armrest of the leather chair. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I swiveled the chair around to face him. Carter froze. The air vanished from his lungs. His eyes bulged wide, taking in the sight before him. He tried to take a step back, but his legs refused to cooperate. He looked at my perfectly tailored charcoal power suit. He looked at my immaculate hair and the cold, dead expression in my eyes. He looked at the vast, intimidating office around me, realizing with sudden, horrifying clarity that I was not a guest. I was not an assistant. I owned the room. I owned the building. I owned him. "Lydia," he gasped the name, tearing out of his throat like a dry, ragged wheeze. "What are you doing here? How did you get in here?" I leaned forward and picked up the single black binder resting on the center of the mahogany desk. I did not yell. I did not show an ounce of the searing rage that had kept me alive in the freezing snow when he threw my suitcase into the street. I simply dropped the heavy folder back onto the desk with a sharp, resounding thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "I am reading your bankruptcy file, Carter," I said, my voice slicing through the air with absolute zero mercy. "I am reviewing the fake invoices you used to embezzle my corporate funds to buy Penelope a luxury car. I am analyzing the fraudulent user metrics you fabricated to steal my money." Carter stood paralyzed, his brain completely short-circuiting as the catastrophic reality finally crashed down on his arrogant shoulders. The anonymous venture capital firm he had been begging for survival was me. The entity holding 80% of his corporate debt was me. The person he had surrendered all his financial leverage to in the divorce papers was sitting right in front of him, holding the detonator to his entire life. I folded my hands over the black binder, leaning forward into the light. "Are you here to beg for my money, Carter?" For a long moment, the only sound in the vast executive suite was the heavy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Carter stared at me, his mouth slightly open. Then, a harsh, forced laugh erupted from his chest. The sound was brittle and desperate. He shook his head, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, attempting to physically shake off the reality standing in front of him. "This is a joke," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "This is some kind of sick, elaborate prank. Who let you up here, Lydia? Did you bribe a security guard? Are you sleeping with one of the executives?" He stepped forward, his arrogance desperately trying to override his panicked confusion. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Get out of that chair! You do not belong here. I have a meeting with the real CEO of Apex Capital. When they find out you broke into this office to play this pathetic little game, they are going to have you arrested. I am calling security right now." He reached into his pocket for his phone. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Call them," I challenged, my voice echoing coldly in the massive room. "Call the security desk, Carter. Ask them to remove the chief executive officer from her own office. Ask them to remove the sole beneficiary of Harrison's empire. Or, better yet, let me save you the trouble." I tapped the control panel on my desk. The massive digital display board spanning the entire left wall of the office flared to life. The screen illuminated the dim room with blinding white light, displaying the exact corporate charter of Obsidian Holdings. Right at the top, listed as the absolute controlling entity, was my name, Lydia. Carter dropped his phone. It hit the plush carpet with a dull thud. His eyes darted from the massive screen back to my face. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. The bespoke velvet jacket he wore suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume on a terrified little boy. "Sit down, Carter," I commanded, pointing to the single, stiff guest chair positioned in front of my desk. He did not argue. His knees seemed to simply give out, and he collapsed into the chair, staring at me as if I had just risen from the dead. "You always thought I was just a boring accountant." I began picking up the heavy black binder. "You spent years mocking my career, telling me I lacked vision. You thought your tech startup made you a genius. But you forgot one crucial detail. I am a senior financial auditor. My entire profession is dedicated to finding the exact lies stupid, arrogant men try to hide in their ledgers. And your ledgers, Carter, are a pathetic, catastrophic joke." I opened the binder and slapped the first stack of high-resolution financial printouts directly onto the desk in front of him. "Let us review your Series B funding application," I said, my tone analytical and razor-sharp. "You claimed a 300% increase in monthly recurring revenue, a complete fabrication. My team tracked your round-tripping scheme. We watched you take the venture capital funds we provided, funnel them through offshore proxy accounts, and buy your own software licenses to artificially inflate your sales metrics. It is textbook fraud." Carter gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "Lydia, please," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I cut him off, tossing another stack of documents across the desk. "I understand that you listed $200,000 in consulting fees paid to a firm called Horizon Solutions, LLC. We pierced the corporate veil yesterday. Penelope is the sole proprietor. You have been laundering investor funds to pay for your mistress's designer maternity clothes and that massive diamond ring you bought her, using my stolen retirement money." He recoiled as if I had physically struck him. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but his brain was completely paralyzed. "And then there is the real estate fraud," I continued, relentlessly pulling out. "The final damning report. You reclassified my former suburban home as a corporate research and development facility. You used my investment capital to pay for imported Italian marble and a luxury nursery. You committed federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and gross embezzlement. You built a house of cards on top of a landmine, and you handed me the detonator." "Lydia, you cannot do this," he begged, leaning forward, his arrogance completely shattered. "If you expose this, the company goes under. We lose everything. I will go to prison. We were married for 6 years. You cannot just destroy me." "You destroyed yourself, Carter," I replied, leaning back in Harrison's chair. "You threw me into the snow. You locked me out. You drained my accounts to zero. You filed a divorce petition accusing me of adultery to steal my house. And you were so blinded by your own greed that you signed my revised separation agreement without even reading the debt severance clause." Carter's eyes widened in sheer horror. The divorce agreement. He finally realized the trap he had eagerly walked into. "That is right. By taking the startup you accepted between us, every business obligation you personally guaranteed, and agreed to indemnify me against the notes. The clause did not create the debt. It stopped you from shifting your existing guarantees and any deficiency back onto me." "Please," Carter gasped, actually slipping out of the chair and dropping to his knees on the carpet. "Please, Lydia, do not do this. I need that $5 million. My mother mortgaged her house. If we do not get that funding, the bank will take her home. We will be out on the street. I will do anything. I will sign the company over to you. Just give me the bailout." I looked down at the man who had tormented me, gaslighted me, and discarded me. He was literally begging at my feet for the very money he thought he was stealing from me. It was the most profound display of intellectual and financial humiliation I had ever witnessed. "I officially deny your request for emergency funding," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Apex Capital will not provide you with a single cent. Furthermore, due to your documented financial fraud and gross violation of our investment covenants, I am executing the acceleration clause on your existing corporate debt." Carter stopped breathing. The acceleration clause meant that every single dollar Apex Capital had ever invested in his company was no longer payable in standard installments. The debt had matured instantly. "I am calling the loans Carter," I said, standing over him. "Your company owes Apex Capital exactly $50 million, and the documented fraud has triggered immediate acceleration. The notes are secured by the startup's assets and founder equity. You also signed personal guarantees covering any deficiency after liquidation. If the company cannot repay Apex, we'll enforce those guarantees, while our separation agreement requires you to indemnify me against every related claim. By Monday morning, I will begin receivership, seize the pledged assets, and forward the audit to federal investigators." Carter remained on his knees, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He was completely broken. His tech empire, his wealth, his arrogant facade had all been vaporized in less than 10 minutes. "Our meeting is concluded," I said, pressing the security buzzer on my desk. "Find your own way out. And Carter, do not ever demand to see the CEO again. You are looking at her." 2 security guards materialized in the doorway, pulling Carter from the carpet and dragging him toward the private elevator. He did not fight them. His legs dragged uselessly beneath him, his eyes staring blankly at the mahogany desk as the heavy oak doors shut in his face. He stumbled out of the Apex Capital building into the freezing rain, completely stripped of his pride, his company, and his future. He drove his leased sports car back to the suburban house with his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the steering wheel. Inside the remodeled living room, Beatrice and Penelope were waiting with champagne. Penelope was browsing luxury vacation homes because she assumed the $5 million transfer had arrived. Beatrice sat on the Italian leather sofa, calculating when Carter would repay the bridge note secured against her house. The first interest payment was due within days, and the balance matured in 90 days. Carter walked through the front door, dripping wet and looking like a ghost. The champagne flute slipped from Penelope's hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. "What happened?" Beatrice demanded, standing up immediately. Her eyes darted to his empty hands. "Where is the funding, Carter? Did the bank delay the wire transfer again?" Carter collapsed onto the entryway bench, burying his face in his wet hands. "There is no funding," he choked out, his voice cracking. "There is no Series B round. Obsidian Holdings is Apex Capital, and Apex Capital is Lydia." The room fell into a deathly silence. Penelope stared at him as if he had started speaking a foreign language. Beatrice's face twisted in sheer confusion. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice snapped, marching over to him and grabbing his shoulder. "Lydia is a penniless auditor sleeping in a motel. Stop talking nonsense and tell me where my money is. I put my house on the line for you." "She owns the lender," Carter shouted, springing to his feet. "She is the CEO of Apex Capital. She knew about the fake invoices and the transfers to Penelope. She denied the bailout and accelerated the secured notes. My company owes $50 million. I personally guaranteed the major facilities, and if the assets do not cover the balance, Apex can pursue me for the deficiency and send the audit to federal investigators." Penelope gasped and backed toward the stairs. Beatrice staggered as the consequences became clear. She had pledged her fully paid estate to a private lender for a short-term bridge note. Carter had spent the proceeds and could not repay the maturity balance. If Beatrice missed the payment schedule, the lender could record a default and begin foreclosure against the collateral. "You signed the divorce papers," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic. "You told me you took the house and the car. You told me you left her with nothing." Carter fell to his knees, breathing in short, frantic bursts. "I thought she was escaping my business debts," he said. "I signed an agreement awarding me the startup and requiring me to indemnify her for every obligation I guaranteed. The company still owes the money, but I cannot shift the deficiency or guarantees back to Lydia. I signed away my protection." Penelope began sobbing hysterically, screaming about how she was going to end up raising a baby in a cardboard box. Carter sat on the floor, completely paralyzed by his own monumental stupidity. But Beatrice did not cry. Beatrice was a creature of pure, venomous survival. Her panic slowly morphed into a cold, calculating rage. She began pacing the imported hardwood floors, her mind desperately searching for a legal loophole to save her suburban castle. "Wait," Beatrice said, stopping in the center of the room. "When did you file the dissolution petition and separation contract?" 2 days ago, Carter answered. "We both signed. My lawyer served her the same afternoon." "Then the final decree does not exist yet," Beatrice said. "Washington imposes a 90-day waiting period after filing and service. The settlement may be binding between you, but the judge has not incorporated it into a decree. If there was genuine fraud in the disclosures, you can ask the court to preserve the status quo and determine whether the agreement should be enforced." Carter looked up. "I signed the debt and trust waivers. What fraud can I claim to—" "Her new position and the Harrison Trust," Beatrice replied. "You cannot simply demand half because Washington courts divide property on a just and equitable basis, and an inheritance is not automatically community property. But you can allege that she concealed a valuable contingent interest and manipulated you into signing an unconscionable settlement. If a judge believes that the court can order disclosure, restrain distributions temporarily, and examine the agreement before the final decree, Carter's breathing slowed as the possibility took hold. And the pregnancy gives you another pressure point, Beatrice continued. It does not make the trust marital property, but a child conceived during a marriage can create a parentage dispute. If the trust protects the unborn child, your lawyer can demand medical records, challenge the identity of the genetic father, and ask the trustee not to distribute anything until the court knows who the beneficiary is. A dark spark returned to Carter's eyes. He could not accept that Lydia had beaten him with documents he signed himself. If he could not claim an automatic half, he would use delayed discovery and public accusation to force a settlement. "We need a lawyer," Carter said. "Someone willing to attack the agreement before the 90 days expire." By nightfall, he had retained Donovan, an aggressive Seattle family law litigator, known for high net worth disputes. Carter promised him a percentage of any recovery and described Lydia as a dishonest accountant who had hidden a fortune while pretending to be homeless. Donovan reviewed the petition, the signed separation contract, and the message confirming Lydia's new position at Apex Capital. He did not promise Carter half of $188 million. He explained that Washington was a no-fault state, that misconduct did not control property division, and that a third-party inheritance was not automatically marital. But he saw a path to an emergency hearing. He could allege fraudulent nondisclosure, seek a temporary order preventing trust distributions, demand a complete financial declaration, and ask the court to refuse enforcement of the separation agreement as unconscionable. Carter pushed the pregnancy test and his sterility report across the desk. Donovan studied both documents. He said the pregnancy could support a separate request for parentage records and could be used to argue that Lydia had concealed a relationship affecting the trust. The argument was thin, but thin arguments could still create expensive delay. "File everything," Carter said. "Freeze whatever can legally be frozen." On Monday morning, Donovan filed an emergency motion in King County Superior Court. He did not claim the court already owned the trust or the unborn child. He asked for a temporary restraint against any distribution from the contingent testamentary trust, expedited discovery into Lydia's Apex compensation and inheritance interests, and an order setting a hearing on whether the separation contract had been induced by fraud. He attached Carter's declaration accusing Lydia of hiding material facts and falsely describing the startup's debts. Outside the courthouse, Carter sent a message to my burner phone. His renewed confidence filled every line. "You thought the papers protected you, Lydia. I have an emergency hearing before the decree can be entered. My lawyer is forcing you to disclose the trust, the company, and the pregnancy records. When the judge sees how you manipulated me, the settlement will be set aside, and you will pay for everything you hid." He sent the message, believing the motion itself had frozen my future. He did not know the signed agreement contained a disclosure schedule bearing his initials, or that Harrison's trust had not distributed a single dollar. I read the text in the Maybach and handed the phone to Bennett. He reviewed it, then opened the scanned settlement on his tablet. Carter's initials appeared beside the contingent trust disclosure, the mutual inheritance waiver, the startup allocation, and the personal guarantee schedule. Bennett smiled once. "He has not found a loophole," Bennett said. "He has requested the hearing, where we will place his informed consent, his medical deception, and his financial guarantees into the public record." The emergency hearing was set for Thursday morning. Carter believed he had dragged me back into a negotiation. In reality, he had chosen the courtroom in which every part of his trap would be authenticated. The emergency hearing was granted and scheduled for Thursday morning in Department 42 of the King County Superior Court. The courtroom was a sprawling space of polished oak and cold marble. I arrived precisely 10 minutes early, accompanied by Bennett and a small team of corporate litigators from his Chicago firm. I wore a tailored charcoal suit with my hair pulled back into a severe knot. I looked every inch the ruthless executive I had become. Carter strutted through the heavy wooden double doors a few minutes later. He was flanked by Donovan, his new predatory family law attorney. Beatrice followed closely behind them, taking a seat in the front row of the public gallery. She glared at me with absolute venom, clutching her designer handbag as if it were a shield. Carter wore a conservative navy suit, playing the role of the aggrieved, hard-working husband to absolute perfection. When he sat down at the plaintiff's table, he shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. He truly believed he had me cornered. He believed his legal maneuver was a stroke of absolute genius. Judge Reynolds, a stern woman with iron gray hair and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, took the bench and slammed her gavel. She looked down at the massive stack of emergency injunction filings placed before her. "Counsel," she began, her voice echoing sharply in the cavernous room. "You have filed a highly irregular emergency motion to halt a finalizing divorce decree. You are alleging massive financial fraud and hidden assets. I have reviewed your preliminary briefs. You have the floor, Mr. Donovan. Impress me." Donovan stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. He walked to the center of the courtroom, projecting his voice so every single person in the gallery could hear him. "Your Honor," Donovan began, "we are not asking this court to punish anyone for marital misconduct. Washington is a no-fault state. We are asking the court to determine whether a separation contract should be enforced when one spouse allegedly withheld information that would have changed every term of the bargain." He walked to the evidence table and displayed the signed settlement on the courtroom monitor. "Carter surrendered no business interest," Donovan said. "He accepted a startup burdened by debt, while Lydia obtained the executive office of Apex Capital and a contingent interest in a trust valued at $188 million. Those facts were discovered only after the agreement was signed. We seek temporary restraints against any distribution, expedited financial discovery, and a finding that the agreement was induced by fraud or was unconscionable when executed." Carter lowered his eyes and played the injured husband. Beatrice leaned forward in the gallery, gripping her handbag as if the judge might hand her the trust before lunch. Donovan then lifted a sealed medical file. "There is a second unresolved issue, Your Honor. Lydia is pregnant. Carter has a documented diagnosis of infertility, and the trust appears to protect a child connected to the deceased Harrison. Until parentage and the identity of the protected beneficiary are established, no prudent trustee should release funds. We request production of the fertility records and an order preserving the trust." He did not say the unborn child was property. He did something more calculated. He suggested that the medical uncertainty proved Lydia had hidden an affair, a beneficiary, and a financial plan, while Carter negotiated in ignorance. When Donovan sat down, Carter looked across the aisle with the same smug expression he had worn in the coffee shop. He believed the words fraud pregnancy and $188 million were enough to erase his signature. Bennett rose without urgency. "Your Honor, the motion fails because every material fact the plaintiff claims was concealed appears in documents he signed and initialed. Opposing counsel has presented suspicion. We will present the record." He handed the bailiff a certified copy of the separation contract with its exhibits. The first highlighted page was the sealed financial disclosure schedule. Bennett read the entry aloud. "Potential contingent interest in a third-party testamentary trust. No present distribution. Value subject to unsatisfied conditions and independent administration. Each spouse waives every claim to the other's gifts, inheritances, testamentary trusts, and post-separation earnings, whether vested, contingent, known, or later discovered." The monitor enlarged Carter's initials beside the paragraph. A second page showed his signature, acknowledging that he had been advised to seek independent counsel and had chosen to sign after receiving the complete agreement. Carter shifted in his chair. Donovan turned sharply toward him. "This was not hidden in a footnote," Bennett continued. "It was a separate schedule attached to the property agreement. Carter accepted the house vehicle household contents and all ownership rights in his startup. In exchange, both parties released claims to separate and inherited property. He cannot transform regret into fraudulent nondisclosure. Judge Reynolds studied the exhibits. Mr. Donovan, did your client initial this schedule? Donovan hesitated before admitting that the initials appeared authentic. He argued that Carter did not know the amount of the trust or Lydia's future role at Apex. Bennett answered with the trust charter. The amount was unavailable for distribution when the agreement was signed because Lydia's interest had not vested. Harrison created an independent, testamentary trust. Lydia was designated as a conditional lifetime beneficiary and proposed trustee only after she obtained a final divorce decree and accepted responsibility for Apex Capital. A child born from the preserved embryos was designated as the protected remainder beneficiary. Until those conditions were satisfied, the independent trustee controlled every asset. No trust money had entered a marital account, paid a marital debt, or been distributed to Lydia. He placed the relevant provisions on the screen. The trust was created by a third party from Harrison's separate estate. It expressly prohibited assignment to a spouse or creditor of a beneficiary. Carter had no ownership interest to waive beyond the claim he already released in writing. Donovan objected that Lydia had become CEO before the divorce decree. Bennett produced the Apex Board resolution. Lydia's appointment was temporary conditional and compensated by a fixed salary disclosed in a supplemental financial declaration filed under seal before the hearing. The trust principal and Apex voting shares remained with the independent trustee pending the decree. Carter had not discovered a secret transfer. He had discovered a conditional job and an inheritance he had already agreed not to claim. Judge Reynolds turned to the medical issue. Bennett opened the Seattle Fertility Center dossier. In 2018, Lydia and Harrison created embryos during their marriage, Bennett explained. Their divorce decree incorporated a notarized disposition agreement granting Lydia exclusive authority over the remaining embryos. Harrison retained genetic parent status for any resulting child, but waived physical custody unless a later agreement provided otherwise. 3 months before his death, the clinic required fresh legal review and written reaffirmation. Harrison signed that reaffirmation through counsel. The clinic verified identity, consent, chain of custody, and transfer dates before performing the procedure. The certified records appeared on the monitor: the original embryo creation report, the divorce disposition agreement Harrison's notarized, reaffirmation, the transfer log, and the physician's pregnancy confirmation. The pregnancy did not result from an affair, Bennett said. It resulted from a documented assisted reproduction procedure using an embryo created years before Lydia married Carter. Carter's infertility is not evidence against her. It confirms that he knew he could not be the genetic father when he accused her publicly. Carter gripped the edge of the table. His performance collapsed as the court saw his medical diagnosis beside the fertility records. The child is genetically Lydia and Harrison's, Bennett continued. Under the trust, Lydia may receive lifetime benefits after satisfying the divorce and management conditions, while the child, upon live birth, is the protected remainder heir. That structure is why Carter cannot claim the trust through marriage paternity or the separation agreement. Donovan tried to recover. Even if the trust is separate, he argued, the settlement should be set aside because Carter received a failing company and Lydia knew the debt would be accelerated. Bennett lifted the business allocation schedule. Carter did not merely receive stock in the startup, he insisted that the company and every related benefit be awarded to him. The schedule identified the Obsidian bridge notes, their outstanding balances, the existing defaults, and the personal guarantees Carter had signed when the loans were issued. It also stated that Carter would indemnify Lydia against any marital exposure connected to those obligations. The loan documents appeared next. Carter's signature was visible on the personal guarantee pages. The startup owed Apex Capital $50 million. Carter did not personally owe that amount solely because of the divorce contract. He faced personal liability because he had guaranteed the secured notes, pledged his founder equity, and agreed to cover any deficiency after liquidation. The separation agreement prevented him from shifting that exposure to Lydia. Apex accelerated the notes only after the audit documented fabricated revenue, round-tripping false vendor invoices, and misuse of restricted investment funds, Bennett said. Those default provisions existed before the separation. Carter received the schedules, declined independent review, and signed because he believed the startup was worth more than the house he was taking from Lydia. Judge Reynolds looked at Carter. "Were you prevented from reading the agreement?" No, Carter answered after a long silence. "Were you denied the opportunity to consult counsel? No. Did you initial the trust disclosure and the business debt schedule?" Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes." The judge set down her pen. "Washington law does not divide property by punishing adultery," she said. "It requires a just and equitable disposition after considering both community and separate property, the length of the marriage, and the parties' economic circumstances." This motion was built on the false premise that marriage automatically entitled Carter to half of every asset Lydia might later receive. It did not. She addressed the contract next. The agreement gave Carter the residence, vehicle, household property, and complete ownership of the startup. Lydia received releases from maintenance business guarantees and claims to contingent inheritances. The allocation was aggressive, but the record showed disclosure, consideration, an opportunity for counsel, and deliberate assent. Carter's present regret was not proof of fraud or substantive unfairness. Finally, Judge Reynolds reviewed the fertility records. The certified documents rebutted any factual basis for Carter's parentage claim. The court did not need to decide the unborn child's final legal status that morning, but there was no evidence supporting a temporary restraint against the Harrison Trust based on Carter's genetics or alleged adultery. The judge denied the emergency motion in full. She refused to restrain the independent trustee, refused to reopen the property agreement, and ordered Carter to pay Lydia's reasonable fees for forcing an unsupported emergency hearing. The signed separation contract would remain enforceable and could be incorporated into the final decree after the statutory 90-day period expired. The gavel struck. Carter had entered the courtroom, demanding access to Harrison's empire. He left with his trust waiver authenticated, his personal guarantees placed into the record, and the medical accusation he had used against me destroyed by the clinic's own documents. Beatrice's hopeful expression vanished. Donovan closed the medical file slowly, realizing that every exhibit Carter had brought into court now strengthened Lydia's position. The courtroom erupted. Beatrice wailed as she understood that Carter's company remained liable for $50 million, that his personal guarantees exposed him to any deficiency, and that her own house secured a separate bridge note he could no longer repay. Carter gripped his hair. He had entered court demanding access to a $188 million trust. Instead, he had authenticated the waiver's guarantees and disclosures that would keep every part of Harrison's estate beyond his reach. "You set me up!" Carter screamed, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. "You set me up from the very beginning!" Judge Reynolds struck her gavel repeatedly until the room fell silent. Her face was a mask of judicial fury, directed entirely at Carter and his lawyer. "The only person who set you up is yourself," Judge Reynolds stated, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "You signed a legally binding separation agreement to maliciously strip your wife of her home and assets, completely ignoring the debt liabilities you were absorbing because of your own greed. You brought a fabricated, defamatory claim of adultery into my courtroom to steal a trust fund that belongs to an unborn child conceived through legal medical procedures. This is the most abhorrent abuse of the family court system I have seen in my entire career." The judge looked down at her docket, picking up her pen. "I am denying the plaintiff's emergency injunction in its entirety. Judge Reynolds ruled, writing furiously. The separation agreement stands exactly as signed. Carter assumes full responsibility for his $50 million corporate debt. The trust fund and the unborn child are entirely shielded from this marital estate. Furthermore, given the fraudulent nature of the plaintiff's filing, I am ordering Carter to pay all of the defendant's legal fees for this hearing. This court is adjourned. The gavel slammed down. It was over. The legal battle was definitively, catastrophically lost for Carter. He was annihilated. I slowly stood up from the defense table. I buttoned my tailored charcoal jacket and picked up my pristine designer handbag. I looked across the aisle at Carter. He was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so severely he could not even pick up his own phone from the table. Donovan was already snapping his briefcase shut, actively distancing himself from a client who was now a massive financial liability. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I had won the war inside the courtroom, but as the heavy wooden doors swung open into the crowded courthouse hallway, the true, brutal consequences of Carter's actions were already waiting to greet him. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom shut behind me, sealing away the spectacular legal slaughter that had just taken place. I walked down the expansive marble hallway of the King County Courthouse. Bennett walked silently beside me, his leather briefcase gripping the certified court orders that cemented my absolute victory. The air in the corridor felt cool and refreshing. I did not speed up my pace. I walked with the slow, measured rhythm of a woman who had just conquered an empire. Behind me, the courtroom doors burst open again. Carter stumbled out into the hallway. He looked completely unhinged. His tie was loosened, his bespoke suit was wrinkled, and his face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated terror. He was frantically grabbing at Donovan, his former lawyer, begging him to file an appeal. Donovan physically shoved Carter's hands away, loudly declaring that their legal representation was officially terminated due to gross client fraud. Donovan marched toward the elevators without looking back, leaving Carter stranded in the middle of the public corridor. Carter leaned against the cold marble wall, struggling to breathe. He thought the loss of his company and his $50 million debt was the absolute bottom of his downward spiral. He had no idea the floor was about to give way completely. The polished elevator doors opened with a soft chime. 6 federal officials stepped into the hallway. 4 wore FBI windbreakers. 2 carried credentials from IRS Criminal Investigation, the unit responsible for tracing tax crimes and money laundering. A sealed criminal complaint and arrest warrant rested on top of the same forensic audit package I had delivered through counsel. The Securities and Exchange Commission had received a parallel civil referral, but the people walking toward Carter possessed criminal arrest authority. The lead FBI agent locked eyes with Carter and crossed the marble floor. "Are you Carter, founder and acting chief executive of the technology company identified in this warrant?" he asked, displaying the corporate registration number and a photograph. Carter stared at the warrant, then at the audit binders. His mouth moved without sound before he finally nodded. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the agent ordered. "You are under arrest on a federal complaint charging wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, false statements to investors, and theft of restricted corporate funds." 2 agents secured Carter against the wall and locked handcuffs around his wrists. He shouted that his company was legitimate and that the court dispute was only a divorce matter. The agents ignored the performance. An IRS criminal investigation agent opened the evidence summary. The government had the round-tripping transactions, fabricated vendor invoices, tax records for Horizon Solutions, transfers into Penelope's accounts, and Carter's signed investor certifications. The criminal warrant came from a federal magistrate after prosecutors reviewed probable cause. Any separate securities enforcement action would proceed through the civil process, but Carter was leaving the courthouse in federal custody. The lead agent also advised Carter that the arrest was based on the financial conduct documented before the family court hearing. Lydia's civil victory had not created the criminal case. His own banking records, sworn investor submissions, and electronic transfers had done that. At that exact moment, the door to the women's restroom at the end of the hall opened. Penelope walked out. She was wearing her expensive designer maternity dress and carrying a luxury leather handbag Carter had purchased with stolen money. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the federal agents holding Carter against the wall. Carter saw her. "Penelope!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Penelope, call my mother. Tell her to get the house equity money back. Tell her to hire a criminal defense lawyer. They are arresting me." The lead FBI agent turned his attention to Penelope. He looked down at the paperwork in his hand. "Are you the sole registered proprietor of Horizon Solutions?" he asked, stepping toward her. "We have a federal warrant to seize all assets associated with that entity, including the vehicle registered in your name, and any luxury goods purchased with laundered funds." Penelope looked at the federal agents. She looked at the handcuffs cutting into Carter's wrists. She looked at the terrified, ruined man who was about to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant, smug illusion of her billionaire lifestyle shattered instantly. She realized she was not standing next to a Silicon Valley genius. She was standing next to a bankrupt federal criminal who was about to drag her down with him. Penelope did not cry for him. She did not rush to his side to defend his honor. Her survival instincts kicked in with ruthless efficiency. She backed away, holding her hands up in the air. "I have nothing to do with his business," Penelope said, her voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I am just a secretary. He manipulated me. He told me he was a millionaire. He told me he bought everything legally. I did not know the money was stolen." "Penelope, you cannot do this," Carter sobbed, struggling against the agents. "I accepted the baby and built our future. I bought you that ring. You promised we were a family." Penelope looked down at her left hand. She stared at the massive diamond engagement ring Carter had purchased by draining my retirement account. She did not hesitate. She pulled the ring off her finger. She tossed it onto the marble floor. It skidded across the polished stone and hit the toe of Carter's expensive leather shoe. "I am not going to prison for you, Carter," Penelope said, her voice completely devoid of any affection or loyalty. "You lied to me. You are broke, you owe $50 million, and you are going to jail. I am done with you." She turned on her heel and walked rapidly toward the emergency exit stairs, completely abandoning the man she had proudly flaunted just days ago. She was already calculating how fast she could distance herself from his radioactive reputation and find a new wealthy target who actually had real money. Carter screamed her name again, throwing his head back in absolute agony. He was bankrupt. He was $50 million in debt. He was going to federal prison. And the mistress he had destroyed his marriage for had just discarded him like garbage in front of a dozen strangers. The federal agents began dragging Carter toward the elevators to transport him to the holding facility. As they pulled him down the hallway, the doors of the courtroom opened one last time. Beatrice stumbled out. She had stayed behind, trying to beg the court clerk for a transcript of the ruling. She walked into the hallway just in time to see her precious golden boy in handcuffs. "Carter," Beatrice shrieked, running forward with her arms outstretched. "What are you doing to my son? Let him go. He is a successful businessman." The agents blocked her path, warning her to step back or face obstruction charges. Beatrice watched in utter horror as the elevator doors closed, taking her ruined son down to federal lockup. She stood in the empty hallway, hyperventilating. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess. Her expensive clothes suddenly looked pathetic. Beatrice's phone buzzed inside her handbag. She read the alert twice. The private lender had declared the bridge note in default after the scheduled interest payment failed, and the criminal freeze made repayment impossible. A notice of default had been recorded against her property. The house would not vanish that afternoon, but the contractual cure period had begun, and a trustee's sale would follow if the balance fees and interest were not paid. The phone slipped from her hand. Carter was in federal custody. The $500,000 she borrowed had been consumed by his company. Her estate was the collateral, and the lender had a first-position deed of trust. She had no retirement reserve large enough to cure the default, and no income capable of servicing the note. She scanned the hallway until she found me near the windows. I stood beside Bennett, untouched by the panic around her. The arrogance disappeared from Beatrice's face. She crossed the marble floor and dropped to her knees, clutching the hem of my suit. "Lydia, please," she cried. "You have the money. Pay the lender before the cure period expires. Carter lied to me. I thought the bridge loan would be repaid after the funding round. I cannot lose my house. I am too old to start again." She grabbed my hand. "I am still your mother-in-law until the decree is final," she said. "You cannot let an older woman be removed from her home. Pay the note, buy it from the lender, do anything. The amount is nothing compared with the trust." I looked down at the woman who had refused me shelter while I was pregnant and freezing. I remembered the silk robe, the warm light behind her, and the satisfaction on her face when she took the car keys. I withdrew my hand and stepped back. "I remember your porch, Beatrice," I said. "I remember asking for one night indoors. You told me the vehicle belonged to Carter's company, and your house had no room for a freeloader. You knew Penelope was waiting inside, and you still left me to walk through the snow." Beatrice's expression collapsed as the memory returned. "I do not own your bridge note," I continued. "Apex Capital is not the lender, and I will not interfere with a lawful foreclosure or use Harrison's trust to rescue a transaction you signed voluntarily. Your lender gave you written disclosures, a maturity date, and a cure period. You chose to pledge your home because you believed Carter's lies were worth more than my safety." She shook her head violently. "Please, Lydia, just one payment. I will sell the house later and repay you." "No," I said. "You demanded the keys when I needed help. When the trustee's sale is completed, you can hand your keys to the lender. The house no longer has room for someone who financed fraud and called it family loyalty." I adjusted the cuffs of my jacket and looked at her one final time. "Buy a winter coat before the remaining credit is frozen," I said. "The bus shelters downtown are colder than they look." I turned away while Beatrice collapsed against the marble floor. Bennett and I walked toward the private exit where the Maybach waited. I had an investment firm to protect, a child to prepare for, and a final divorce decree to obtain when the statutory period expired. I would not spend another dollar preserving the comfort of the people who had calculated my destruction. Her request was not an apology. She never asked whether the pregnancy was safe, whether I had shelter that first night, or whether Carter had returned the money he stole. She asked only for the asset that preserved her status. 1 year is a remarkable measure of time. Exactly 365 days ago, I was standing on a frozen sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on my back and a shattered heart. Today, I am standing behind the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the executive suite on the 50th floor of the Apex Capital building. The Seattle harbor stretches out below me, bathed in the crisp golden light of an early winter morning. The waters of the Puget Sound are calm, reflecting the towering steel skyscrapers that define this city. I hold a cup of black coffee in my hand, feeling the ceramic warmth seep into my skin. The cold no longer frightens me. I own the building that casts a shadow over the very streets where I was once left to freeze. I turn away from the window and walk back toward the center of the massive office. Resting perfectly in a custom bassinet near my mahogany desk is my son. He is 3 months old, and he is fast asleep, wrapped in a soft cashmere blanket. I set my coffee down and gently lift him into my arms, holding him close to my chest. He stirs slightly, opening his eyes for a brief moment. My breath catches every single time he does that. He has Harrison's eyes. They are the exact same shade of striking, intelligent blue. Looking into them is like looking into the soul of the man who loved me enough to orchestrate my survival from beyond the grave. Harrison never got to hold our child, but he built an impenetrable fortress to ensure this little boy would never know a single day of fear or instability. Under Harrison's trust, I am the lifetime beneficiary and trustee, while our son is the protected remainder heir to the financial empire. More importantly, he is surrounded by absolute, unconditional love. I press a kiss to his warm forehead, promising him silently that the toxic manipulation I endured will never touch a single hair on his head. I walk around the desk and sit down in the heavy leather CEO chair, gently resting my son against my shoulder. The past 12 months have been an absolute whirlwind of corporate restructuring and relentless financial warfare. When I first took over Apex Capital, there were whispers among the board members. They wondered if a former senior financial auditor could handle the aggressive, cutthroat world of high-level venture capital. I did not just handle it, I completely dominated it. I purged the firm's portfolio of every single fraudulent, inflated startup. I fired any executive who relied on predatory lending tactics and replaced them with brilliant analytical minds who actually understood sustainable growth. By applying strict auditing principles to our investment strategy, I eliminated billions of dollars in risk. The resulting profit margins completely shattered industry expectations. Under my direct leadership, Apex Capital has not just survived the transition, we have completely doubled our annual growth. The $188 million trust Harrison left behind has multiplied, expanding into an undeniable financial juggernaut. I proved to the entire financial district that ethical, rigorous accounting is far more profitable than arrogant Silicon Valley illusions. On the far wall of my office, the massive digital display screen is silently running a local financial news network. A breaking news alert banner suddenly flashes across the bottom of the screen, catching my attention. I pick up the remote control and unmute the audio, keeping the volume low so I do not wake my sleeping son. The news anchor's voice fills the quiet room, reporting live from the steps of the federal courthouse downtown. The camera pans to a man being led out of the building by two armed federal marshals. It's Carter. He is wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. His hands are heavily shackled to a chain wrapped tightly around his waist. He looks completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, smirking tech founder who used to parade around in bespoke velvet jackets is entirely gone. His hair is thinning and unkempt. His face is gaunt, hollowed out by months of brutal federal litigation and the crushing reality of his absolute ruin. He looks terrified small and utterly defeated. The news anchor reads the sentencing report with clinical precision. Carter has been convicted of federal wire fraud, money laundering, false statements to investors, and theft of restricted corporate funds. The judge cites the scale of the scheme, the fabricated revenue, and Carter's complete lack of remorse. He receives a sentence of 120 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The court also enters a restitution judgment covering the proven investor losses and orders forfeiture of assets traceable to the fraud. The federal system does not offer parole, although ordinary statutory credits may affect the exact release date. Even after custody ends, the unpaid restitution will remain enforceable against Carter's future income and property. His startup founder shares, vehicles, and personal accounts have already been placed under receivership for liquidation. The camera then shows Penelope leaving through a separate courthouse entrance. She did not receive blanket immunity. Under a cooperation agreement, she pleaded guilty to a reduced conspiracy count, admitted that Horizon Solutions submitted false invoices, and agreed to testify against Carter. The judge imposed probation, home detention community service, and restitution rather than prison because of her cooperation and pregnancy. Every asset purchased with diverted money was forfeited, including the vehicle designer clothing and engagement ring. She walks toward a public bus in inexpensive clothes, carrying court papers and an electronic monitoring schedule stripped of the luxury Carter promised. I mute the television, letting the silent image of Carter being shoved into the back of a federal transport van serve as the final punctuation mark to his pathetic existence. He tried to destroy me to secure his stolen wealth. Instead, he handed me the exact tools I needed to permanently lock him inside a concrete cell. There is no anger left in my heart. There is no lingering bitterness. There is only the cold, objective satisfaction of an audited ledger balancing perfectly to zero. Debt incurred, debt collected. A soft knock at the heavy oak doors pulls my attention away from the screen. Simon, my trusted executive vice president, steps into the room, holding a thick, leather-bound portfolio. He smiles warmly at the sight of me holding the baby before walking over to the desk. The final incorporation documents are ready for your signature, Madam CEO, Simon says, placing the portfolio respectfully in front of me. The legal team has expedited the federal tax-exempt status, and the initial funding transfers are queued up in the escrow accounts. I carefully adjust my sleeping son, supporting his weight with my left arm, while I open the portfolio with my right hand. The documents inside represent the most important investment I will ever make. It is not a venture capital acquisition. It is the official charter for a brand new non-profit organization. I am personally endowing a massive legal and financial defense fund dedicated exclusively to women who have been subjected to financial abuse, domestic manipulation, and sudden eviction. I know exactly what it feels like to be thrown into the freezing night with empty bank accounts and zero legal protection. I know the sheer terror of facing a wealthy, manipulative spouse who controls all the resources and uses the legal system as a weapon of intimidation. My new foundation is designed to completely level that playing field. We are retaining a dedicated strike team of the most aggressive family law attorneys, forensic accountants, and emergency housing coordinators in the country. When a woman is locked out of her home or stripped of her financial assets, my foundation will step in immediately. We will provide instant emergency capital, secure safe housing, and deploy a ruthless legal team to freeze the abuser's assets before they can hide the money. We will offer the exact impenetrable armor that Harrison gave to me to women who desperately need a lifeline. I pick up my heavy gold fountain pen. I look down at the signature line on the master charter document. I sign my name with smooth, deliberate strokes, officially transferring $10 million of my personal wealth to launch the foundation. I hand the portfolio back to Simon. Execute the transfers immediately, I instruct him. My voice filled with quiet conviction. And tell the legal team to begin taking on clients by Monday morning. I want us aggressively pursuing every single fraudulent spouse attempting to hide marital assets in this state. We are going to make financial abuse an incredibly dangerous game to play. Simon nods, his expression reflecting deep admiration. It will be an honor to facilitate this, Madam CEO. He turns and quietly exits the expansive office, leaving me alone once again with my son. I stand up from the mahogany desk and walk slowly back toward the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The heavy rain clouds that often blanket Seattle are finally beginning to break apart, allowing brilliant shafts of sunlight to pierce through and illuminate the harbor. I look down at my baby boy, who lets out a soft, contented sigh in his sleep, safely cradled against my chest. 1 year ago, I thought my life was completely over. I believed the lies my abusers told me. I thought I was a failure because a cruel, arrogant man decided I was disposable. But the truth is that toxic people do not determine your value. They only reveal their own profound limitations. They rely on your silence and your loyalty to fuel their own parasitic survival. The moment you stop making excuses for their cruelty, the moment you gather your evidence and recognize your own brilliant, undeniable worth, their entire house of cards immediately begins to collapse. You do not have to accept the narrative they try to force upon you. You do not have to walk away empty-handed just to buy your peace. You have the right to demand absolute accountability. You have the right to audit the people in your life and cut the ones who bring you nothing but toxic debt. I look out at the boundless blue horizon, stretching endlessly over the Pacific Ocean. A warm, genuine smile spreads across my face. I am not a discarded wife. I am not a helpless victim crying in the snow. I am a mother. I am a chief executive officer. I am a woman who built an impenetrable fortress out of the stones they threw at me. And I will never let anyone make me feel small again.